Hey all, so somebody asked me to do more videos of story reading and storybook time. So I'm going to read a story from True Horror Storybook by Terry Deary. I read this all the way through and didn't put it down as I really enjoyed it. So I'm going to read Lizzie Bordens' Axe. I can just find the page. Fall River, USA, 1892. The Bordens were the most important family in the town of Fall River. They had been there for hundreds of years, yet the Bordens' house was not so very grand. Old Andrew Borden was too careful with his money for that. A cold, hard, loveless man, in 1892 he was 70 years old. He would not live to see 71. Number 92 2nd Street was comfortable enough for Andrew Borden and his family. Comfortable but not grand. The house was warm in winter. Down in the basement was a coal-fired furnace. Near the furnace was a chopping block with a stack of wood for lighting the fire, and near the chopping block was an axe for splitting the wood into sticks. There were 4 women in the house: Andrew's daughters, Emma and Lizzie, their stepmother Aimee Borden, and the maid servant Bridget. Mrs. Aimee Borden was 63 years old in 1892. She would not live to see 64. Aimee never managed to take the place of Emma and Lizzie's mother in the hearts of the young girls. Number 92 2nd Street was not a happy house. Lizzie was 32 in 1892. She had learned meanness from her father, so she was disgusted and angry when her father gave a gift of land to his wife's family. She never forgave and she never forgot. Something seemed to snap in Lizzie's strange mind. Lizzie, Mrs. Aimee Borden said one day, "I haven't seen my cat for ages. Do you know where he is?" Lizzie wasn't beautiful, but her large, light eyes were the most attractive thing about her. "Go downstairs and you'll find your cat," she promised, and those eyes glowed with pleasure. Mrs. Borden went down to the cellar and found the cat. It had been laid across the chopping block, and someone had cut its head off from the wood axe. But that was nothing to what happened on the morning of the 4th of August 1892. Excuse me. A hot and humid morning. Even at 6:15 in the morning, the sun was blazing hot as maid servant Bridget struggled downstairs to light the cooking stove. She felt ill. Everyone in the house had been ill the day before, maybe from eating meat that had gone bad in the summer heat. Emma was spared because she was away on holiday. Emma was spared because she was away on holiday. After breakfast, Mrs. Borden went upstairs to lie down. She was still unwell from the food poisoning of the day before. Mr. Borden went into town to do business while Bridget set about cleaning the windows. By 11:20, Mr. Borden had returned. He struggled with the locks on the front door. Someone had pushed the bolt in so hard that Bridget could hardly open it to let her master in. Lizzie stood at the top of the stairs. She laughed. Mr. Borden strode in. "Where's your mother?" "Out, she had a message to go and visit someone who's sick," Lizzie answered. "Who?" "I don't know, Father." "They can't be sick as me," the old man snapped. "I still feel weak from yesterday. I think I'll lie down in the sitting room." Lizzie smiled. It was 2 minutes to 11. Bridget went back to washing windows as Lizzie set up an ironing board and started ironing handkerchiefs. "Excuse me, Miss Lizzie, but I feel sick again," the girl groaned. "If you don't mind, I'll just lie down." The maidservant climbed up to her attic bedroom. The City Hall clock was striking 11. Bridget lay down on her bed. 10 minutes later she heard Lizzie cry out, "Bridget, oh Bridget, come down!" Bridget struggled from her bed. "What's wrong, Miss Lizzie?" "Come down quickly, Father's dead." "Somebody's come in and killed him," Lizzie shouted. Bridget went to the sitting room to look. Lizzie stopped her. "No, don't go in there. Go and get a doctor, run." But Bridget couldn't find the local doctor. She left a message with the doctor's wife and hurried back to number 92, 2nd Street. "How did it happen?" the girl groaned. "Where were you, Miss Lizzie?" "In the garden," Lizzie Bordens sighed. "When I came back in, the door was open wide." A neighbour, Mrs. Churchill, saw the frantic woman and came across to find out what was wrong. She opened the door to the sitting room. Andrew Borden lay on the settee where he'd gone to rest. His feet were on the floor. His head was resting on the arm, but it was a head that no one would have recognised. There were 11 cuts between his nose and ear. One blow had sliced his eye in half, and another had almost cut his nose clean off. Blood splattered the floor, the wall, the sofa, but Andrew Borden hadn't moved. His murderer had slaughtered him as he slept. Mrs. Churchill backed out of the room. Where were you when it happened?" she gasped. "In the barn," Lizzie murmured. "Your poor mother must be told. Where is she?" Lizzie struggled, helpless. "She went to visit a sick friend. I don't know who." Mrs. Churchill took charge. She sent messages for the doctor and the police. By 11:30 she had returned to the house of death on 2nd Street. "If only we could find your mother, Lizzie. Maybe we should send a message to her friend, Mrs. Whitehead." "No!" Lizzie answered sharply. "I'm sure I heard her come in the front and go up to her room. Bridget, go and see." But shaking, sickly, Bridget wouldn't go alone. "I'll go with you," Mrs. Churchill offered. The two set off up the front stairs. They didn't need to climb quite to the top. The bedroom door was open. Bridget stopped. Behind the bed, half hidden, lay Aimee Borden's body. Mrs. Churchill pushed past the rigid maidservant and looked at the gruesome sight. 19 blows had rained down on the back of her head, and no one had chopped deep into her neck. But the blood had dried and started to turn dark. It seemed that Aimee Borden had died some time before her husband. No note was ever found. The truth was that Aimee Borden had never left the house. She must have died soon after breakfast, and Lizzie had never gone into the barn. The floor was dry and thick with dust. The first policeman in the barn would swear that there was not a single footprint in the dust. Could Lizzie have lied? Lizzie was the one the police suspected, but Lizzie was a Borden, a lady from the finest family in Fall River. Surely she could not have butchered both her stepmother and her father, could she? In that hot house, which was home to such cold, cold people, Lizzie Borden stayed cooler than ice. As her parents' corpses still lay in their blood-stained rooms, she said calmly, "I think I'd prefer them to be buried by Undertaker Winwood." The next night, Lizzie placed an advert in the local paper. That same Friday, the Fall River police found a new, amazing fact. The day before the murders, Lizzie Borden had been to a local chemist shop and tried to buy some prussic acid, perhaps the deadliest poison known. On Saturday, the funeral was held for Aimee and Andrew Borden. On Sunday, Lizzie was seen trying to burn an old dress. "Why are you doing that?" a friend asked. "It's covered with paint," she said, "but it looks so suspicious, trying to burn old clothes. The police will say you're trying to hide bloodstains." "Ah," Lizzie gasped. "I didn't think. I only wish you'd stopped me." "But Me and Lizzie Borden had burned a dress that was only 10 weeks old, something unheard of in the penny-pinching Borden house. And 1 week after the murders, the Fall River police arrested Lizzie Borden for the crime. The trial was almost a year later, and in the middle of another heat wave. It was 93 degrees Fahrenheit outside the courtroom and hotter still inside. On a table lay a bag. It was covered with tissue paper. The lawyer threw a piece of evidence onto the table, one of Lizzie's dresses. The dress caught the bag and the tissue flew off. Now Lizzie could see what was in the bag. The shattered skulls of her father and stepmother. Lizzie fell into a dead faint at the shock, but the shock was not great enough to make her confess. She sat silent through the days of the trial. At last, her lawyer pleaded that the jury must either set poor Lizzie free or be blamed for placing a hangman's noose around her neck. He reminded them that Andrew Borden had gone to his grave wearing a ring that was a gift from Lizzie. To find her guilty, he finished, you must find her a fiend. Does she look it? The 12 men of the jury looked at Andrew Borden's little girl. Her large, pale eyes looked back, eyes that had never shed a tear for the deaths. Yet, as her lawyer claimed, the eyes that cannot weep are the saddest eyes of all. The judge turned to her and asked, Lizzie Borden, have you any words you wish to say to the jury? She rose slowly to her feet, bowed to the judge and looked straight at the 12 men. I am innocent. I leave it to my counsel to speak for me. 13 words, the only words that Lizzie Borden spoke at her own trial. The jury voted. The clerk of the court asked, Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached your verdict? We have. What do you say? Not guilty, Your Honour. A huge cheer swept the courtroom. Lizzie sat back in her seat and at last managed a tear, in sheer relief that her neck had been saved. Take me home, she muttered. Take me home. I want to go to the old place tonight. Lizzie went back to the house of death and lived with the ghosts of her butchered father and stepmother. She died 34 years after the trial in 1927. Her sister Emma died 9 days later. Lizzie Borden left over $1 million in her will. Some say that Lizzie got away with murder. So who killed the Bordens? There were 3 explanations. The hidden killer. Fact file. Mr. Andrew Borden was not a popular man. There must have been many men and women in Fall River who wanted to see him dead. Number 2. The killer slipped poison into the Borden's milk on Wednesday morning, 3rd of August 1892. It made them all sick but didn't kill them. So on the morning of 4th of August, the killer crept into the Borden house while Mrs. Borden and Lizzie were upstairs. The maid Bridget rushed out to be sick and left the back door open. The killer waited. Mrs. Borden received a note asking her to visit a sick friend, but Mr. Borden returned home feeling ill and lay down to sleep. The killer crept out and with one of the axes from the Borden cellar hacked Andrew Borden to death. The killer was forced to hide because Lizzie came back from the barn and started ironing in the next room. Lizzie discovered the body and Mrs. Churchill sent for the police. While Mrs. Churchill went for help, Mrs. Abby Borden came home. The killer followed her upstairs and murdered her with the same axe. The killer escaped out of the front door while the police were coming to the back door. This was Lizzie's explanation, and the one the judge chose to believe. The trouble is, the experts said that Mrs. Borden died before Mr. Borden, a fact the judge ignored. The public believed it at first. They spent days in terror believing a mad axeman was on the loose in Fall River. So there you have it, Lizzie Borden's axe, and that's from the True Horror Stories book by Terry Deary. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm still getting used to reading all this stuff because I'm dyslexic, so I hope you at least enjoyed some of the story anyway. Take care, bye.